So I think I'm going to start now. People will probably straggle in. We've actually sold more tickets than I've seated, but I want Malcolm to have time to go through his lecture at his own pace. So I'm Ike Kong. I'm the Assistant Director and Chief Curator here at the museum. And this lecture is part of our series, the Curator's Choice series, and it's meant to showcase some of the most distinguished academics, art historians, curators in the field. So our speakers are hand-picked by the curators to highlight certain parts of the collection. And in this case, because we've got the British Modernism show on, I thought it would be really great to have the expert on Millet here to address earlier art of the Victorian era, since that's part of our collection that's not nearly as fleshed out. And of course, you can't really understand modernism in Britain until you've understood what came before. So this is one excuse to bring him out, also because he happens to be somebody I really adore. You'll remember that we got to work together with the Kimball Art Museum on the Picasso and Bach show. So, Malcolm has already been here before. He's also not too far away now. He's in Laguna. He's the executive director there and has been since 2012. But before that, he was the deputy director at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, which is where I first met him. And before that, he was senior curator of paintings and sculpture at the Yale Center for British Art and curator of European art at the San Diego Museum of Art. So he's really come back to Southern California, where he's always belonged. He really is considered the specialist of Millet, and he's doing, in fact, the Catalogue Raisonné. And he's actually published a book on a very famous portrait that belongs to the Kimball by Millet, and that's available in the store. He just kindly signed a few copies for you, so if you have the inclination, you can go and buy a copy for yourself. He's definitely very well known as a curator and has overseen some really great shows, including a blockbuster show of pre-Raphaelite art that took place at the National Gallery all the way back in 1997 now, and a Millet portraiture show at the National Portrait Gallery in London in 1999. And most memorably for me, he was the curator of the Stubbs and the Horse show that I got to receive at the Walters, which was definitely one of the funnest shows I've ever done. And then also at the Kimball, he did a really fantastic show featuring portraiture from the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection in Madrid, which was also very, very successful. So today what I asked Malcolm to do, and he was kind enough to oblige, is to go back to his roots and to really offer a kind of overview of everything that we would say the modernists maybe rejected, or at least tried to supersede, as you'll see in the exhibition. So please join me in welcoming Malcolm to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Ike. I feel the same way. And it's great to be a curated speaker. Well, I hope there are some Anglophiles here this evening. If you enjoy British painting, the chances are that one of the things you'll love is 18th century British portraits. And indeed, in the United States, these have tended to be the kind of British art that has been most popular. Indeed, when Henry Huntington bought the Blue Boy here for the Huntington, for his collection, which later became the Huntington in San Marino, he paid more for it than anyone had paid for any painting of any nationality before. It was a huge, newsworthy event. And that was typical of Anglophile taste in this country. People say that maybe it's because American collectors wanted to kind of connect to a kind of semi-mythical idea of Britain as a land of elegance and grace. And this kind of survives to this day. I mean, it's sometimes a mystery to us Brits why you love Downton Abbey so much. But I think it comes out of the same desire to see England that way. And of course, English art is very much associated with landscape painting. Constable came up with this canonical vision of England as the green and pleasant land, with lots of attention paid to details of the workings of the countryside. These boys here are unhooking the rope with which this horse was towing a barge along a canal, because they have to propel it under a bridge here. This boy's got a pole to do that with, and then they're reconnected on the other side. So he's a country boy, and he's painting with a country boy's knowledge of the English scene. And then by contrast, also working in the early 19th century, I'm getting to the Victorians gradually here, but here's Turner. Turner, who of course is the great English romantic landscape painter, for whom nature was this unknowable, swirling experience, ungraspable, which he represented, like perhaps most characteristically here, having experienced a storm at sea by being tied to the mast of a ship so he couldn't be swept overboard. This is his memory of that experience. You know, it's kind of the washing machine experience of nature. We now, many of us, think of Turner as possibly the greatest of all British artists. Arguably he was. But in his later life, where during the reign of Queen Victoria, she came to the throne in 1837, he suffered a lot from being a landscape painter, because people were still sure that the greatest paintings were not landscapes and not portraits either, actually, but storytelling paintings, history paintings as they would have called them, which dealt with allegories, historical events, mythology, and perhaps most of all, scenes from the Bible. If you'd asked a Victorian who the greatest artist of all time had been, he or she would definitely have said Raphael, the great Italian Renaissance painter, and this is one of his Holy Family subjects. He was the prince of painters as far as the English art establishment was concerned. You know, there are many great collectors in England. That's why the National Gallery in London is so fantastic for Italian art as well as British art, because England, actually, to tell the truth, has always had a bit of an inferiority complex about its own artists, and always tended to prefer ones from other countries. But it was kind of at its height at this time in the Raphael worship that went on. And so it's not surprising that when, and here at last we come to actual Victorian painting, when Queen Victoria commissioned a portrait of herself from her favourite painter, Winterhalter. This is a court portrait of her celebrating the first birthday of Prince Arthur here, one of her many children. Here's the Prince Consort, Prince Albert in the background, her husband. And this is the Duke of Wellington. You know, the Duke of Wellington was the victor at the Battle of Waterloo. He'd crushed Napoleon, so he's a tremendous hero in Britain. So when she came to commission this portrait, it's not surprising somehow that she wanted Winterhalter to make her look as much like a Raphael Madonna as possible. You know, this was absolutely in tune with the taste and the hierarchy of art of the time. It's a portrait, but it's kind of trying to be a history painting too. It's meant to look a little bit like a biblical scene, because the Duke of Wellington is bringing a gift here, but of course, and we're getting near Christmas, so isn't he a bit like one of the Magi bringing the gifts to the baby Jesus? So there's definitely a religious undercurrent to this work, but also a very contemporary one, because Albert was one of the moving spirits behind the first great World's Fair, which was, in a way, the kick-off to the High Victorian period. It was called the Great Exhibition, and he's looking anxiously over here because he's worried about the opening day. Because the kid's birthday happened to fall on exactly the opening day of the Crystal Palace. So this is the Iron Duke, as he was called, and this is the Crystal Palace. It's like they're two different eras of England. You know, the age of like heroism and glory that saw the defeat of Napoleon, and in the case of the palace here, the Crystal Palace, this gigantic iron and steel building here in Hyde Park, it's the modern age. Let me show you a picture inside. This was what it looked like inside. And it was this great showplace for the manufactures and produce of the whole world, but of course with British ones right at the center of things. Britain at this time had much to celebrate. It was the most powerful country on earth. The Industrial Revolution had been, well, kind of invented in Britain, and certainly had been very kind to Britain in terms of its prosperity, its economic and political power. England was a world of coal mining and shipbuilding and mills, dark satanic mills, most of them, that really fueled this sense of superiority on the part of British people of the Victorian Age. There was a sage of the time, you know, this philosopher called Thomas Carlyle, who dubbed the Victorian Age the mechanical age. You know, we've been through periods in the past where we were the moral age or the heroic age, but here, most of all, in Victorian times, we're the mechanical age. It's still pretty moral too, actually, as I'll show you in a while. And they're very religious too, actually. They're constantly worried about religion in ways that I'll touch upon. But predominantly, it's an age that runs on mechanics and engineering and fact. You know, the Victorian period is a great age for science. They want to know how things work and put things into practice. And I think that comes through in their art too, in ways I'll talk about. Well, right about this time, there was a group of young artists who had been students together at the Royal Academy schools in London, and they formed themselves into a little kind of resistance group because they didn't like what was going on in British art. They didn't like Raphael worship. They thought that they could take on the kind of highbrow subjects that Raphael had painted, and which some British artists were trying to emulate him in, but they could do it in a way that was more in tune with the mechanical age. And this is the kind of thing they came up with. This is Millet's Christ in the Carpenter's Shop, shown at the Royal Academy exhibition in 1851. So it may not look very factual and realistic. It's meant to be, of course, Christ here in the center. He's cut his hand on a nail because he's working in his father Joseph's carpenter's shop, and a drop of blood has fallen down onto his foot, and it's all a premonition of the crucifixion, of course. Here's his mother, the Virgin Mary, next to him, looking anxiously at the wound, and Joseph also looking at it. This is John the Baptist on the right-hand side. How ingenious of Millet to get a bowl of water into the hands of John the Baptist. Because that's what he's going to do when he fulfills his sacred role in life. But in this context, he's just bringing some water to bathe his friend Jesus' wound. And then we've got sheep in the background, suggestive of the Christian flock. This is the mother of the Virgin. Here it is. Saint Anne in the background. There's a lot of symbolism in this work, and a lot of realism too, compared with Raphael. When you think back to that Raphael composition, it was so perfect, wasn't it? All those figures of the Holy Family, they were all building themselves into a perfect sort of orchestration of curvy lines that bound them all together in an idyllic sort of way. They looked like heavenly people. Very beautiful. They didn't look like people from the first century in the Middle East in any sense. They looked like the Virgin Mary was an Italian beauty queen. The Jesus and his friend John the Baptist were both like bouncing bambinos. You know, the completely unrealistic approach. Comparatively speaking, Millet was taking a realist's view. People were shocked that St. Joseph here, the carpenter, has dirty fingernails. That's a detail they focused on. They were shocked that Jesus has red hair, because there was no tradition of that. In fact, red hair was generally reserved for Judas. If you look at pictures of the Last Supper in the Italian tradition, Judas is often recognizable because he's the one with the red hair. No offense to anyone with red hair here, but it was associated with kind of sin. So it was a very provocative thing. But what Millet was trying to do was to bring a breath of truth into a tradition of painting that he felt, with Raphael and all these many imitators through the ages, had forgotten about. It was time for some truth. And that was completely in tune with the general tenor of the times in which he was living. So in a sense, he was trying to be modern. He got so much flack for that Christ in the Carpenter Shop, though, that he drew back from religious subjects a bit after that. This is one of his follow-up paintings of Ophelia, the most popular painting at Tate Britain in London now. It sells more postcards than any other picture. And it's the heroine of Shakespeare's Hamlet, of course, who is so distraught at the behaviour of Hamlet, her lover, who has actually murdered her father, that she loses her wits and sings songs by the bank of a river, and eventually sort of slumps into the river, almost unaware of what she's doing, and floats downstream a little bit, still singing songs, and eventually drowns. She mentions a lot of flowers in the scene leading up to this, and Millet includes a lot of them in his painting. He adds a few of his own too, like a poppy here for death. You've probably heard of the language of flowers. It's a big thing in Victorian England. If you sent someone a certain combination of flowers through the mail, it meant, "I love you, but we can't go on seeing each other like this," or something like that. It was an old language, you didn't need words. So Millet drew upon that in a lot of ways in the combination of flowers. There are violets around her neck. Here are like a chain necklace of violets. Violets in the language of flowers mean the death of innocence. One thing I love about this painting is the way he's smuggled in, I don't know if you can see it, but just here, he's smuggled in a kind of a skull. It's not literally meant to be a skull, but it's an accidental configuration of light and shade that you can see as a skull. And that ties in, of course, with the famous "Alas, poor Yorick" scene in Hamlet, and the general theme of death. But what a hymn of praise to nature this painting is. Completely different from Raphael and the Raphaelite tradition, in the way that detail is taken right to the edges. For example, there's no discrete fuzzing around edges like there was in conventional painting. There's a kind of rawness to nature too. It's not kind of dressed up to be ideal, and indeed it really, every single leaf in this painting is a portrait of a particular leaf that was right there on the riverbank where Millet painted this. Long before the French Impressionists, who often get credit for doing this first, the PreRaphaelites went out into, in this case, into the field. He found a stream that would do for the scene, and painted the whole background, brushstroke by brushstroke, with tiny brushes. Incredible detail, all from nature, all right there in front of the scene itself. You know, there were bugs getting stuck in the paint and everything. It was a heroic kind of enterprise, really, but he saw it through. It took like several months to finish. And it was the attention to nature that most attracted about the PreRaphaelites, as they called themselves. The name was they kept it kind of secret. They would sign under their names on paintings. They would sign PRB for a while, and people would ask them what it meant, and they'd say, "Please ring the bell," or sometimes rather lewd things that I'm too embarrassed to repeat. But anyway, one of the things that attracted their great champion, John Ruskin, to them was the way they went to nature, as he said, selecting nothing and rejecting nothing. They took it wholesale. And in that respect, they were going against idealization, which had been the primary impetus for art for centuries, Raphael on. They were throwing out the general idea that art has to be beautiful and improve on nature, make nature better. They were saying we've got to go to nature without doing that, just taking it really very literally as it is, putting it under the microscope almost. Well, the model for this painting was Elizabeth Siddal, who was the girlfriend of one of the other pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, Dante Gabriel Rosetti, a good friend of Millet's at this time. So Lizzie Siddal had to lie down in a bath to get this right in his studio. He'd done the background already, and so during the winter months, he worked on the figure in the studio. Also took ages to do. She was in a bath, and the water was kept warm with some candles underneath, but they went out once, and the water got cold, and she was a very shy young woman and didn't say anything, but caught pneumonia as a result, poor thing. And her father threatened Millet with a lawsuit until he agreed to pay all her medical expenses. And she survived. So John Everett Millet was one of the leading members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, who flourished they formed themselves together in 1848, and they were a dedicated band of brothers for a period of about 6 or 7 years, but very, very important and influential. I believe really the best painters the Victorian period produced. One of his friends was William Holman Hunt. Hunt painted this picture in a neighbouring field while Millet was at work on Ophelia. Now, a hireling shepherd is a temp. It's not the regular shepherd. It's one that's brought in when the regular shepherd is, on vacation, if shepherds have vacation, or whatever. There's a parable in the Bible about a hireling shepherd who, of course, doesn't care so much about the flock. So he lets things go to rack and ruin. And if you know anything about sheep, you'll recognize that these are in a bad way here. They're getting all bloated because they're eating the wrong kind of grass. And this lamb here, this shepherd with whom the hireling shepherd is flirting with a shepherdess here. And this lamb on her lap, she's feeding it these rather unripe apples, which are also not good for it. Incredible attention to detail. If you saw this painting, you probably think this image is a bit sort of heightened in colour or something, but actually the real painting is even more luminous than this. They were trying to capture the brilliant light and colour of the real outdoors in a way that artists have never done before. But beyond the realism, there are always this symbolical meaning. And believe it or not, this painting, on the symbolic level, is about clergymen, who Holman Hunt was very dissatisfied with at this time. The Church of England was in a bit of disarray at this point because there was a kind of surge in Roman Catholicism. And if you know British culture, you'll know that we're all, British Protestants, who are of course the majority, are a bit paranoid about Roman Catholicism. But that feeling reached a height around this time. And everybody recognized that what Hunt was doing was criticizing English clergymen who flirt with things that aren't very important. They dilly-dally, they indulge in all kinds of philosophical niceties, but they're not really looking after the flock, the Christian flock. And horrors, some of the flock, like this sheep here are wandering off into the golden cornfield of Roman Catholicism. And this little vignette here of the lamb being forced to eat the wrong kind of apples was even seen as being something to do with the way that the young were being taught within the Church of England, Sunday school, not being very good because it's too highfalutin and not digestible to young minds. So you can see why, it's very easy to make fun of this kind of painting. I mean, I love it too, but I can certainly see that, the funny side. And it's very easy to understand how the moderns, who are the subject of the great exhibition that's here at the museum at the moment, how the modern British artists of the 20th century looked back on this kind of thing with contempt and ridicule. Clive Bell, one of the chief theorists of modern art in Britain, when it came around, like World War II period onwards, he described PreRaphaelite painting as a sermon at a tea party. I mean, it was so damning, wasn't it? And they wanted to get away from, the moderns, wanted to get away from this sort of thing. Well, I don't, so I'm going to show you a lot more. Here's another Holman Hunt, and I hope you're getting in the mood for this kind of thing now. This is all about fallen women. This poor woman here is a kept woman, perhaps more precisely. She's in a rather cheesy flat in St. John's Wood in North London, and her man is this fellow here who, in the terminology of the day, would have been described as a heavy swell. He's a sort of rather foppish, vain, aristocratic young man who has no intention of ever marrying this woman, but he's just keeping her in a flat for his own immoral purposes. And she's got a ring on every finger of her hand except the wedding ring finger, because she'll never get one from him. Their relationship is like a cat tormenting a bird here. So here it is, right there under the table. But she's seeing the light. It's called The Awakening Conscience. What's happened is that he's singing a song to her. You can read what the song is on the piano here. It's called Oft in the Stilly Night. It's a song to words by Thomas Moore, the poet. And the words go, Oft in the stilly night, ere slumber's chains have bound me, fond memory brings the light of other days around me. Someone remembering their childhood. And she's remembering the innocence of her childhood and realizing what a terrible fall from grace she's suffered in her life now that she's living in sin. But she's looking out into a garden. This is a mirror here. This is her back. You see, she's looking out into a sunlit garden, so she's seeing the light. Nature is perhaps having a great effect on her. She's going to escape from all this gilded cage that she's living in. The clock says 5 minutes to noon because it's near the big change in her life. And you can go on and on, teasing out the meanings in this painting. Unraveled piece of tapestry here, and so on. Even this music here in the bottom corner, they're always using the corners, Pre-Raphaelite painters. You can read this one. It says, "Tears, idle tears." And it's a musical setting of a poem by Tennyson, the great poet of this age. And the tears in the poem come to the eyes of the poet as he thinks of days gone by. Same sort of theme. Originally, Holman Hunt painted the young woman with tears flowing down her face. But the first owner of this painting, who bought it from the artist, tried to live with that for a while, but he couldn't stand it, and sent the painting back, and Holman Hunt repainted the face with no actual tears on it. Well, the PreRaphaelites were very famous in their time. At first, scandalous. because people were offended by things like Millet's Christ in the Carpenter's Shop. But slowly people warmed up to the idea that maybe these young men have got something. They're treating serious subjects, storytelling, which is the highest form of art, and they've found a style that maybe is the right style for the modern age, because it's factual. And it carried over into their influence on landscape too. There's a wonderful painting by William Dyce, also in Tate Britain, where many of these great Pre-Raphaelite pictures are. This is a place on the coast of Kent, where St. Augustine landed when he brought Christianity to England. In the sky, you can't see it in this image very well, but right here, there's a comet. And then the other thing you have to know about this particular scene is that these cliffs are full of fossils. Now, if there was something that really ate away at the Victorians, despite their great self-confidence, it was religious doubt. You know, this is the age when Darwin, and not just Darwin, but other scientists like geologists, are making people doubt the literal veracity of the Bible. And fossils, of course, were a very touchy subject for that reason. So here at the place where Christianity literally came to England, we're a Pre-Raphaelite artist with all his attention to truth and fact is telling us about the fossils, telling us about the astronomical phenomena, the comet in the sky that is just one of the many things that astronomers are telling us suggests that the universe is much older and much bigger than was dreamt of in previous philosophies and religions. So a landscape that's full of, in a way, religious anxiety. Well, of all the Pre-Raphaelites, Holman Hunt was the one who stuck most to the style. I'm going to, in a moment, try and talk about the way things shifted away from the Pre-Raphaelite approach a bit in subsequent generations. But Holman Hunt stuck to his guns way to the end of his life, painted in a very detailed style, very full of facts. And he had this idea about how to paint religious art. Unlike, when Millet did his best working in London doing the Christ in the Carpenter's Shop, but Holman Hunt went one step further and made repeated trips to the Holy Land in order to paint his religious subjects that he became very famous and very popular for in his later career. This is Christ. Again, you get the realism. He's got very hairy legs. Find me an Italian painting of Christ where he has hairy legs. It just doesn't exist. But this makes it all more believable to a doubting Thomas of an age who want facts before they'll believe. And Hunt gave them that. By couching religious painting in a very factual, realistic, truthful style, he was reassuring them that all this stuff in the Bible is actually true. Symbolism too, of course. Christ is a young man. He's working in the carpenter's shop, and he stretches one day, and his mother recognizes an ominous shadow on the back that presages the crucifixion. Look how Hunt has smuggled a halo into the picture too. He couldn't bring himself to do an old-fashioned halo, which is so unnatural, isn't it? It doesn't make sense. But by accidentally on purpose having Christ's head placed just at that point in the window, it gives him a halo. So Hunt was very, very, very popular in his time, and so were many other Victorian painters. In a way, one of the key differences between the modern age represented in your exhibition here now and the Victorian age is that the Victorians, they really were into modern, contemporary art, the art of their own time. And these artists I'm talking about, they might have got off to a shaky start, a bit controversial at the beginning, but they made lots of money in the end. This was a great age for art, whereas 20th century British art, it was lived on a shoestring, really. And people like this guy, William Powell Frith, amassed huge fortunes painting popular works for the public which reached the public not just through the actual painting, but through engravings like this one. Really high quality black and white reproductions that were very inexpensive and were avidly bought up by middle class art lovers who could never have afforded to buy a full-fledged one-off unique painting because they were just too expensive. The railway station. It's all about what goes on in a railway station. Like there are some policemen here who are catching a criminal just as he was trying to escape into the carriage here. Some bridesmaids saying farewell to their friend the bride as she's arm in arm with the groom. They're about to go on their honeymoon. Lots of different... there's a gentleman here who, with a cab driver who's holding his hand out for a tip because the guy hasn't given him one, I guess. There are lots of genre observation of everyday events, and they loved this kind of thing, where they could read lots of stories into it. Remember, this is this is the great age of the English novel. This is the time of Charles Dickens, when people are avidly gobbling up stories all the time, and they wanted the same thing in their art too. Well, this too brought down the wrath of the moderns when we come to the 20th century. Roger Fry, another painter of 20th century, also wrote a lot about art. He said this was an artistic Sodom and Gomorrah. Full of sin. Because it was all about things other than what he considered to be the proper province of art, which was playing around with forms and colours, not telling stories. Telling stories, that's for novels, anyway. I don't mind stories. I like them. Well, I want to just for a moment to contrast what the PreRaphaelites and other fact-based artists of the time were doing with what was going on in France. Because Monet, too, of course, painted in the railway station, just like Frith. But what a different conception of it there is. You can't see any stories here. You can just about make out that there are people and trains and the railroad sheds and so on. His interest is clearly other things. He wants to capture the way that buildings are half obscured by the smoke from the steam. He wants to capture a fleeting impression, such as you might get if you looked at this scene very quickly. So there are huge differences between Victorian art and Impressionism. Of course, the British artists of this time very much looked down on French art. It's a funny reversal that's taking place now, where Impressionist painting is the most beloved painting in the world, certainly in the US. For most of my British painters, these were just very suspect foreigners who throwing paint around in a very immoral way. They didn't like, what little knowledge the British had of the Impressionists. They really disapproved of them partly because of the lack of workmanship. In an industrial age of the Victorian Age, they valued hard work and good craftsmanship, and here were these painters just, painting in a sloppy way as far as they could see. But I did want to make one point about the commonality between French Impressionist painting and the Victorians, because actually they were looking for facts too. The French Impressionists, they were just looking for optical fact, like to be true as possible to the way we see the world. The Victorians, the PreRaphaelites especially, were kind of putting the world into a vitrine and looking at it almost like it was an object on display in an exhibition, looking at every single detail. And the Impressionists were looking at it more in the open air, more rapidly, as I've said. But still, they both, in their different ways, were looking to be more truthful than art had ever been before, and that's the mark of their times, very much. Different forms of realism. Well, now I want to talk about a bit of a shift that takes place from the 1860s onwards in British art, away from that kind of obsession with getting things right and accurate. Amongst more progressive artists like Rosetti. Rosetti had been a member of the original Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but he's best known for works that really shift away from the original principles. Look how fuzzy this image is, really. Very un-Pre-Raphaelite. You can't really compare this, in a way, to Ophelia or the Hireling Shepherd. It's Lizzie Siddal again, though. She was the girl who was in Ophelia. You remember she's Rosetti's girlfriend, but she died young of an overdose of laudanum, which is sort of kind of heroin, right? And Rosetti painted this as a memorial to her, where he casts her as a figure from the past, very typically Victorian, looking back to actually medieval poetry. The work of Dante is Dante himself, the Florentine poet, you know, the Middle Ages. This is the angel of love. Beatrice here, Beatrice is the beloved of Dante, and she's kind of whisked up to heaven in a kind of rapture. It's almost not like dying in his description. So Rosetti identifies with Dante. He was called Dante, by the way, because his father happened to be a scholar of Italian literature who named him Dante. But he certainly tried to live up to that. He made a very romantic gesture. When they buried Elizabeth Siddal after her overdose, he insisted on throwing the only manuscript copy of a lot of poetry that he'd written into her coffin. But then a few years later, a publisher persuaded him that, he shouldn't have done that. And sure enough, they had her exhumed, and so he could get the poems back to publish them. And the story is that the book had got all completely entwined in her hair, which had continued to grow after her death. That's the sort of story that surrounds the Pre-Raphaelites. All right, you know, if you're into that, if you enjoyed that story, there's plenty more in a lot of the books about the Pre-Raphaelites. Later, Rosetti fell in love with Jane Morris, who was married to one of his followers, William Morris, the great designer of wallpapers and stained glass, very famous now. William Morris's wife Jane was this stunning, curly-haired beauty who Rosetti became completely obsessed with as an unattainable object of desire, really. So he painted her over and over again, often in roles that suited that general idea of someone he can't have. La Pia is she's another character from the writings of Dante, his hero. And La Pia is locked up in a tower by her jealous husband in the story. So there's a parallel to Jane Morris being unattainable because she's sort of locked up because she's married to another man, to William Morris. But you see how kind of dreamy painting has gotten here. It's not quite so avidly in touch with nature. Not so specific about its storytelling. It's a character from a story, but there's not much storytelling involved here. And that's a shift away. Rosetti is one of the founding members, really, of a tendency in British art that's sometimes called the aesthetic movement. Meaning, aesthetic in the sense of striving for beauty. Because the Pre-Raphaelites, really, whatever you say, they weren't really all that interested in beauty, they were interested in truth. But here there's a shift where Rosetti is painting beautiful women in a way that's as beautiful as possible. Other painters, too, around this time, 1860, they start to kind of indulge themselves, if you were looking at it through Pre-Raphaelite eyes, in just painting wonderfully beautiful children, especially, usually with rather expressionless faces. This is a portrait, so maybe you couldn't expect it to tell the story, but you'll see that this young girl, May Sartoris, as painted by Leighton, is part of a kind of a whole sisterhood of girls and young women who populate British art from this time, who aren't really doing very much or expressing very much, but just looking beautiful. With a touch of melancholy too. There's just a hint here. Look at this tree that's been cut down that's behind her, with dead leaves here, that somehow he wants to remind us perhaps that her youth and beauty are a passing thing, just like everything in nature, it will die and decay. So there's this melancholy written into the picture too. And one of the great exponents of this mode is Whistler, the American painter. We call him American, but he came to Europe aged about 19 and never came back to the US, and spent most of his working life living in London and latterly Paris. Anyway, Whistler made his debut in the London art world with this wonderful painting called The White Girl. And it became almost like a manifesto of the aesthetic movement in a way, because people assumed at first from the title that this must be an illustration to, do you know a novel by Wilkie Collins called The White Girl? Fantastic, rattling good story by a friend of Dickens. Wilkie Collins is The White Girl. And Whistler said, absolutely not, nothing to do with that. I don't believe in telling stories in my paintings at all. And that little disagreement, it really sums up what he was trying to do here, because he's trying to move painting away from narrative towards a more pure celebration of beauty, a beautiful woman with maybe a touch of melancholy about her. People have speculated that this bare skin here might perhaps be something to do with some kind of male sexuality, perhaps, that she's been the victim of. At the time, people said, well, maybe if it's not the white girl from the novel, maybe it's a woman who's feeling a bit disappointed the night after her honeymoon night. But Whistler said, no, absolutely not that either. It's nothing so specific. Painting isn't about telling those kind of stories. And in the wake of this kind of thing, you get, for the Victorian era, quite fun-loving artists coming into the picture. This Frenchman, James Tissot, he was a huge fan of Whistler's and actually called himself James because James was Whistler's name too. Originally he was called Jean-Jacques. Anyway, he comes to England and he loves the Whistlerian approach to art, which is about visual pleasure. And he takes it into whole very comical realms too. I love this artist, James Tissot. As far as we know, there was no actual ship called the HMS Calcutta at this time. But there was a joke in French where if you say Calcutta, it sounds a bit like "Que cul tu as," which means "what a backside you have." which is why you know that musical review, "Oh Calcutta." That was why that was called "Oh Calcutta." It was nothing to do with the city in India. So here, Tissot sort of builds his whole composition around these ladies' backsides, really, doesn't he? Everything seems to be, all the world seems to be curving in response to them. But anyway, Tissot is a bit of an anomaly. I couldn't resist throwing him in, but really the more characteristic Victorians are a bit more sober than that. But I did want to show you the famous Whistler's mother here. Whistler is a very influential and important artist in British art for the moderns as well. Of all the Victorian painters, maybe he's the most important for understanding 20th century. And here again, he's painting his own mother. You'd think that it might be something a bit personal. She was this nice old lady who looked like she was from another era, obviously, in the way she dressed. And yet he very much distances himself from her. She's got no expression really. It's almost as if she's a still life object, just put into an arrangement with these perfectly placed elements like the picture frames and the curtain and the parapet and everything, just to make an almost abstract looking composition. And look at the title he gave the work too, not My Dear Old Mum, or anything like that. He's called it by a musical title. And there's another thing that very much looks forward to the future when art starts even to try and liberate itself from representing anything. What he's saying here through that choice of title is that maybe art doesn't have to have a message or tell a story. Maybe art can be just like music, that you can enjoy on a purely sensual level. Very important, that pointer to the future. This one, he very much liked Chopin's nocturnes, so he called these night scenes that he did nocturnes. They're scenes of fireworks displays at a pleasure garden near where he lived in Chelsea. But they're very abstract. He's chosen a real scene, the fireworks display, that in itself looks a bit abstract. But to make that the subject of a painting, to a lot of people seemed very willfully kind of provocative. Ruskin got very hot under the collar. You remember Ruskin is the great fan and champion of the PreRaphaelites. He said he's heard a lot about Cockney impudence, but never expected to see a coxcomb charging 15 guineas or whatever it was for flinging a pot of paint in the face of the public. You know, he just went on fulminating like that in print about this painting when it was first exhibited. And Whistler, who was had a wry sense of humour, thought it would be funny to take Ruskin to court for libel. And there was this whole trial where Whistler got to say these fantastic things, like the lawyer would say to him, "So, how long did it take you to paint this thing?" You know, expecting him to say, "Well, 20 minutes." And Whistler said, "A lifetime." Very brilliant replies, which really put Ruskin in his place. And Whistler won the trial, but he was only awarded a tiny amount of damages, and it rather ruined him financially, actually, to pay the lawyers. But there was another kind of nodal point where all these issues in British art came together. Realism versus the aesthetic movement. So as I said, Whistler looks forward to a lot of what happens in modern art in a wonderful way, I think. But the followers of Rosetti continued throughout the Victorian period. Queen Victoria died in 1901. And up until that point, this kind of art was still going on amongst really quite progressively minded artists who I think were finding something in their times that these dreamy escapist paintings kind of were appropriate for. I suppose what I mean by that is that there was a certain amount of disaffection creeping into the British mood at this time. At the time of the Great Exhibition, 1851, they were gung-ho, optimistic, everything was going great. But by the 70s and into the 80s and 90s, they were looking around and seeing all the dreadful pollution that the Industrial Revolution had created. They were looking at all the social problems, child labour, all these terrible, wrenching developments that had happened way too quickly in British society as a result of the Industrial Revolution. They were looking at the rise of the US and Germany as economic powers in the world, maybe challenging the preeminence of Britain. So that they didn't feel quite so self-confident, and art, I think, to some extent responded to that with great artists like Burne-Jones, a younger follower of Rosetti, just not really even thinking of the world outside the studio anymore. He wants to retreat into this world of perfect beauty that he can create in his studio from beautiful models, beautiful objects, mostly medieval in his case, because that was another level of escape from the present time. You know, if he's creating this mythic world, mythic image of the Middle Ages, it's an alternative to today. So much more of an escapist impetus than you see in the middle of the century. Sometimes it takes a medieval form, sometimes it's in a classical form. Albert Moore and other painters dressed their beautiful, dreamy women in classical garb, draperies. They were very influenced by the sculptures of the Parthenon. And there grew up a whole philosophy around the idea of Hellenism, the kind of the admiration for ancient Greek culture and its legacy in the world. But what a different type of classicism this is, looking back to the ancient Greeks, from, say, what went on around the time of the French Revolution in France. If you think of the painter David making classical paintings, scenes from ancient history, in a very severe masculine style. This is a whole different world of classicism that's to do with beautiful female figures who are either asleep or nearly asleep for the most part. It's a sort of the ultimate end of this tendency towards expressionlessness. They wanted these women to be as beautiful as possible, so the last thing they wanted was for them to have very distinct expressions, like are they reacting to something, or do they have a strong character? They didn't want that. They wanted a blank expression, just like often in fashion photography today. Blankness is kind of de rigueur. And then here, actually one of the most beautiful of all Victorian paintings, Lord Leighton's Flaming June. The incredible thing about this was that in 1963, this painting was on the art market in London, priced at £50. So if you've been there, it's worth a lot more than that now. And that's a measure of how much the moderns, the artists in your show here, kind of got their way in the 20th century, because they beat the hell out of the Victorians in terms of reputation, so that by the 1960s, all these artists who have been revered in their own time had come to the point where you could buy their paintings on the Portobello Road for 50 quid. It was amazing. They've come back now, though, I'm glad to say. So the classicists among the nostalgic Victorian painters, the ones who looked back to ancient Greek especially, like Leighton, they're obsessed with draperies. They love that, the flowing draperies. They wanted to create an alternative world to smoggy, cold London by taking us to the Mediterranean. It's almost as if this sleeping girl might actually be just dreaming that she's in this sunny, wonderful Santa Barbara kind of place in Mediterranean, with oleanders just like in Santa Barbara. And it's almost as if, if you've been to London, you might have visited Lord Leighton's studio, because it's now a museum. But anyway, I like to think of this painting as being like a scene from his studio, where actually he's painting his model posing, but painting her dream of a warmer, sunnier place than horrible grey London, where outside the studio window you could probably see sleet falling down, and fog rolling in, and smog, and you could hardly breathe for the air pollution. This is an escape to something else. What I've been trying to describe, I suppose, is a sort of ding-dong between realism, the PreRaphaelites, and a worship of beauty, which isn't necessarily some kind of a reversion to Raphaelite attitudes in some senses. Some art historians have theorized that tends to happen in response to changes in the times. When times are good, people can indulge themselves in realism. They don't mind facing the truth when the truth is pretty good. Whereas in bad times, like towards the end of the Victorian era, relatively speaking, bad times, not quite so optimistic, the artists tend to retreat and tend to offer the world an escapist alternative to reality. The part of the fears came true in the fears that the Victorians were growing on the Victorians came true with World War I, of course. They they had a sense that the Industrial Revolution was providing the countries of the world with the most horrible, deadly weapons of war, the like of which the world had never seen. And World War I was all the more of a shock because of the carnage that this new industrial killing machinery could reap. And of course, this is by Paul Nash, who's in the exhibition here. He was a war artist and horrified, like everybody else, of any sensitivity to what went on. And the title is, of course, ironic. By the end of World War I, it had become quite common for progressively minded people to be heavily critical of the Victorians. In 1918, a writer called Lytton Strachey wrote a book called Eminent Victorians, which was just making fun of all the heroes of this bygone age, the age of his father and his grandfather. He even made fun of Queen Victoria, which would have been unthinkable in her own time. And it was because people came to blame this horror of World War I on the Victorians somehow, that they'd caused it. So amongst artists, there was a feeling in the modern era that there was a need to wipe the slate clean, to get away from telling stories, from moralizing, from the sermons at the tea parties, from symbols, from conventional, dreamy, languorous, wilting beauties, from an escape from nostalgia too. Nostalgia, the kind of tendency to always be dwelling on a bygone age, like whether it's medieval or classical. They came to think that there was a new way forward for painting, which was to express things through form and colour, and to play around with forms and colours in a way, in a manner that gets across what you want to get across, so that the way you paint, in other words, is more important than what you paint. That was a new idea in modern art. And they took their lead from French painters of recent years, from the post-impressionists and from Matisse to some extent. So this is the kind of new, fresh attitude that comes about, and which you see in the exhibition here at the museum, because of the new contempt that generally feeds into the younger culture in response to what the Victorian patriarchal figures of the Victorian Age had done to them in World War I. Well, my favourites are the PreRaphaelites, of course, because I've completely forgiven the Victorians for all this myself, and I still love Victorian paintings. And for me, I feel like they deserve to enjoy a better reputation than they do. Part of the problem in this country is that the PreRaphaelite paintings are so few and far between. It took so much work to do one of those things, which was part of the point, that not many of them got finished. And very few of them are in this country. You have to go to London to see the best of them. But for me, they opened up a wonderful way of seeing. It's like putting on a new pair of spectacles to look at Holman Hunt's Hireling Shepherd or something. Both in the sense of literally seeing things very clearly, but also seeing through to some kind of possibility for symbolic meaning beyond that. I love that way of seeing the world. But perhaps their most lasting legacy, the PreRaphaelites, is when you think of them as an avant-garde group. Because they were this embattled young minority group, at the beginning anyway, who were kicking against the system and the establishment, trying to do something opposite from what the older generation had been doing. And in that respect, I think they led the way. Because modern art from that time onwards is a succession of kicks against what had gone before, whether you're talking about Cubism in France or developments in British art in the 20th century, the vorticists or whatever, represented in the exhibition here. So in that sense, I think the good old PreRaphaelites were a little bit more modern than they're generally given credit for. So thank you very much.
take questions after all. But thank you so much for